welcome back to my channel and welcome to day 4 of my 2022 Valentine Card Series. Today I'm going to be making a card using Hello Bluebird's Next Door Gnomes and Word Buddies Woodland. So I've stamped those images out with Lawn Fawn jet black ink on some Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock. I'm also going to be coloring to match the Gather at Home 6x6 paper pad by Cartabella. So I'm going to tear out a sheet to use as my inspiration and tuck that under my cardstock panel. I'm going to be coloring with my Copic markers, and I'm going to start with my little gnome's skin. For that I'm going to use E000, E00, and E11. So I'm going to start with the E11, and on the little girl I'm going to go up under her hairline. I also colored in most of the right side of her face since you can only see a little bit there, and the flowers that she's holding would be casting a shadow there. I also added a little bit to the underside of one of her arms and in the crease of the one that's kind of folded up, and then on her legs under the hem of her dress. And then I'm going to blend that out with the E00. I also colored in her neck fully with those darkest two shades, but on the rest I will save some room for that highlight shade, the E000, and use that to fill everything in. For the boy gnome, I thought about doing his skin in a different tone, but I decided to make him a redhead. I had done some redheaded gnomes at Christmas time and really liked how they turned out, and thought it might be fun to kind of continue the story and have one of the gnomes from that scene be now kind of visiting his girlfriend. So I went with the same skin tone since redheads are typically lighter skinned. At least in my family I've got a lot of redheads. So I'm going to go back and do his ear because I forgot to do that, and then I'm going to give them both some rosy cheeks with R000 and R01. It was a little bit too pale for me. I started with that R01, but then I added in the R11 to brighten that up a bit because it does dry back and I wanted it to show up, you know, after it did. And then I went around the edges with the R000. And now I'm going to do her hair, and I wanted her to be kind of like a dirty blonde shade or very light brown, golden brown. So I went with E41, E42, and E43. And when I do hair, I do it the opposite of how I do everything else. I typically color darkest to lightest, but hair I do lightest to darkest. And that's just because even though I've been doing it for a little while now, it's still a little bit out of my comfort zone, and it's much easier to add the dark in than it is to take it away. So that's why I start light and then build up that color. So I added the E41 where I want the darkest to go, and then worked my way up to the E43, and then I'm going to work my way back down in the reverse. And I typically start with like a 3-color combo, but then I often want a little more contrast. I really like contrast in my coloring because I think that's just what makes your images really come to life. And so I usually assess from there and pull in a darker shade. In this case it was the E44 to add a little bit of like some low lights in there, so it just gives it more dimension. And then I usually blend that back out with just 1 or 2 of the other shades. I won't do all 3 of the others because there's just not a lot of room there to blend back out all the way, or it might oversaturate the paper. So I think I used the E43 and then skipped to the E41. And then I thought I would tie that color in with her shoes, so I used the E44 and the E43 on the toe. And I'm going to do his boots as well. So I'm adding that E44 at the back of his boots and also in the crease where the front meets the top of the toe. And then I'm going to blend that out with the E43 and use a little of that E42 on the toe of his boots since there's more room for more coloring. And then to tie in the lighter tones of this combo, I decided to do the envelope and make it look a bit vintage. I started with the E42 and then I'm going to blend that out with the E41, and I didn't want it to get too dark, so I decided to add in the E40 for my highlight, and that is going to tie back into like her hair tone. So I'm tucking a piece of cardstock underneath that panel so I can move the marker caps back a bit. I do film in front of a large window, and that is really the only light source. And so if the day starts to get dark or clouds kind of pass in front of the window, it creates a bit of shadow. And someone had mentioned recently that the shadows were falling on the images, so I was just trying to move those caps back a bit away from the images so you could see them clearly, but also still clearly see the caps so you know what colors I'm using. So I'm moving on to his red hair and using YR12, YR14, and YR18. And because his hair is drawn in to be curly with that scalloped edge at the bottom of his beard, I started by coloring everything in with the YR12, but then with the other two shades I'm adding little dots, and that's going to help it look curly. And just like I did with the girl, I kind of like do the 3-color combo and then assess, realized I needed more depth, and then added in the E18 for that. It is a little bit dark, but I'm going to go back over it with 2 of the other shades just like I did before. I think I did the darker 2 this time, YR18 and then YR14, and that is just going to help it kind of disperse a bit and kind of blend into the rest of the hair. So now I'm going to move on to all of their clothes and accessories and really start to pull from that palette in the pattern paper. So for her hat, I'm using YR00, YR01, and YR02. Started with the YR02 and put some shadow down at the bottom and also in the little curve on the top right. And then I'm blending that out with YR01 and YR00, and then I felt like I needed another shade, so I pulled in YR000, and then I'm going to go back over that in a second layer to just really make everything nice and smooth and nicely saturated and all of that. So I'm just going back over everything really quickly, and then I'm going to move on to the flowers in her arms. I wanted to mimic the flowers in the pattern paper and have them be white with that peachy center. So I'm going over those with the YR01, and some of them I'm coloring in solid because they looked like a different kind of flower. So for those I just use the YR01, and now I'm going back and adding the YR02 to the centers of the daisy looking flowers and then to the bottoms of the tulip looking flowers. And then it was still a little bit peach to me, and I felt like it needed a touch of pink to match that pattern paper, so I went back to R000. And then for her dress, I'm gonna go with some greens, but I wanted kind of like a combo between the light pattern paper and the dark green leaves. So I settled on G40, YG41, and YG45. So I started with the YG45 for the shadows, blended out with the YG41, and then added a touch of G40 for the highlights. And I really do like this combo. I think that's the first time that I've used these together, and I really liked it. So I decided to use the same thing on his hat and just use a bit more of that YG45 since there's more room. So on the larger image, I found that it didn't blend nearly as well as I wanted it to, the YG45 and the YG41. So I am going to go back and do some tip to tip in just a bit, but first I filled in with the G40, and then I'm going back with a second layer of that YG45 because I wanted it to be a bit darker. And then here is where I'm going to lay in some YG41 and then realize that it's just not blending well. It's kind of pushing each other away. So I'll just pick up a little of that YG45 and bridge that transition area between those two shades. I also decided to do the little ball looking flowers with that G40, and then I'm coloring in all the leaves in her bouquet with the YG45. For right now, I'm just coloring them in solid and being careful that I don't miss any. And then to give those a bit of depth, I'm going to pull in G28 and just do like a very small little mark at the base of each leaf to give it a bit of depth and like a little line down the center. And then I wanted to also give him some green pants, but I didn't want it to exactly match his hat, so I decided to use that G28 in the combo. So I started with that and added some shadows like under his shirt and also in the creases at the back of his knees. And then I'm blending that out with the YG45, and I'll use the YG41 for the highlight. And in those small areas, it does blend nicely. It's just the larger areas that you have to help it along a bit. And then I'm going back to R000 and R01 for her apron. I wanted it to be nice and soft, but still kind of tie into everything. And just kind of mimic the way that that peachy pink part of the flowers in the pattern paper blends into the white part. I will come back and add some detail to that in a bit, but first I'm going to move on to my balloon, and I did pull in that R11 again for some more depth. So I use that as the darkest, blend it out with the R01, and then I'm using that R000 for the highlight. And then once I have given her apron a little bit of time to dry, I'm just going to go back and add some polka dots. So I'm just doing like diagonal lines of polka dots so that I can keep them kind of straight. And then I did make sure to kind of have a few that ran off the edge so it looks like a continuous piece of fabric. And I also did add a little bit of dot detail to the balloon in the darkest shadowed areas. It's just going to be subtle, but I thought it would give it some texture. And then for his shirt, I decided to go back to my E40s. So I went with E40 and E41. I wanted to keep that light as well so that I can do some plaid pattern on that. So I'm going to come in with E42 and start to do some diagonal lines going from the bottom right to the top left. And then I'm going to cross over and do it in the opposite direction. And then between those lines, I'm going to do stripes using the E41. So it'll be a little bit of a two-tone plaid, although these shades are very close. So if you wanted a little bit more difference, you might do the E40 or even the E44 if you wanted darker mixed into that plaid. And I used the E44 for his button, and then I trimmed these images out with their matching dies. For the background, I'm going to take one of the Hello Bluebird nesting circle dies and cut out a piece of Bristol smooth surface cardstock, and then I'm going to watercolor a background on that using my Zig Clean Color Real Brush pens. The first color that I used was 045 Pale Green. Just added a bit of that on there, and then I wanted to darken that up with 041 Light Green. And I just layered those right on top of each other so that they would blend together nicely, and you would see little bits here and there of both. And then for the sky, I'm going to mix 052 Bright Yellow and 021 Light Carmine to try to create kind of that peachy pink shade that would look like maybe a sunset. And I did try to stick a little bit away from the outside edge. I wanted to keep the edge white. So, and I just adjusted. If I needed a little bit more pink, then I just added a bit more of that until I got a color that I was happy with. And then I'm just going to add a bit more of that green on there as well. As things start to dry back, I can see what colors I want to add in there, and then I'm going to set that aside to dry naturally because it'll be the brightest that way. In the meantime, I'm going to go back to my paper pad. I already know that I want to use the back side of that piece as well, but I was looking for one more print to kind of tie things together. I really liked that dark green and thought that might work well, but I wanted to see what all my options were. And ultimately, I decided to go with that. So I'm going to tear that out. And I wanted to show you guys that even if you don't have a certain die, you might be able to make something that you already have in your stash work for you. I really wanted to have a scalloped border on this card, and I was looking at that gallery frame 2 die and saw that scalloped edge and thought that would be perfect. So I'm going to trim down a small piece of cardstock with that, and it's longer than what I need, so I can just cut off the ends to make it work on my scene. So now I'm going to stamp my sentiment. That background piece is dry. I'm going to do that in VersaFine Onyx Black ink, so it'll be nice and crisp. I'm stamping the sentiment that says, "There's gnome one like you," and I did stamp that down twice to make sure I had a good impression. I felt like the O in gnome was a little light, so I just pressed that down again, and then I'll set that aside to dry. That ink does take a little while to dry permanently. And then I'm going to pop my card base in my MISTI. I'm using a piece of Lawn Fawn apricot cardstock and Peachy Keen ink. And I'm going to take 2 more of the gnomes, another boy and another girl. The girl is blowing some hearts, so I thought that would be cute. And I also added a separate little heart image. And then the sentiment, "You're My Favorite," is from the Typed Everyday stamp set. I'm sorry I forgot to show that one, but I will have it listed and linked in the description bar with all of the other products that I used. Now that I've got all of my elements, I can start the assembly. I'm going to adhere that floral pattern to the top of the card. I did cut that down to fit perfectly on my A2 standard size card. And then I'm going to add the back of that, which is the peach plaid print, down at the bottom. So just making sure everything is lined up nice and straight. And then I'll take that scalloped border and add that to the little area between them so it looks a little more seamless. And you would never know that that came from the outside edge of a frame die. So then I'm going to grab my focal panel. I've added some foam tape to the back of that, so I'll peel off those release papers, and I'm going to center that in the top floral portion of the card, making sure that the sentiment is nice and straight as well. And then I'll grab my images, and I'm going to start with the girl gnome, and I'm going to adhere her over on the left hand side using my Barely Art Precision Craft glue. And I'm going to add her right above that sentiment. And I think that background ended up matching really nicely with the Copic coloring. Then I'll take the boy gnome and I'm going to add him over on the right hand side. And then before he is glued down permanently, I'm going to tuck that heart balloon behind his left hand, the hand that's on our left, and so it looks like he's holding it. And in the right hand, I'm going to add that letter. So he is bringing his girlfriend all these goodies for Valentine's Day. I decided I wanted a little heart seal on that envelope to tie it in a little bit more with the theme, since this isn't like overtly Valentine's. It's more peach and green instead of the traditional red and pinks. But, you know, sometimes it's fun to do something a little outside the box. So I just drew a little heart right above the flap of the envelope, and then I'm going to add some Stardust stickles on that heart. I'm also going to add a few little dots on the balloon heart just to tie into the dot detail that I added earlier. And I'm also going to add a little bit of sparkle to the centers of all of the little flowers, just adding a tiny little touch so that it really adds some nice glimmer when you lift that card into the light. I also decided to add in a few sequins. I used a sparkling clear sequin mix from Pretty Pink Posh. So I just laid those down and now I'm gluing them with my Barely Art Precision Craft Glue and my Studio Katia embellishment wand. I'm just picking those up and then setting them back down in the glue. And then to fill in the centers, I'll go back to my Stardust Stickles and just add a bit. I really like filling in the little holes. I think it just gives you another place to add a little bit more sparkle on a card, and who doesn't love that? So just a little bit there, and then I'm going to pick that up and tip it into the light so you can see how pretty that is. And I will give you another peek at the inside of the card as well. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. I post new ones every Monday and Friday. As I mentioned, all of the products that I use will be listed and linked in the description bar below, so you can just click on that to check them out if you're interested. And if you'd like to keep watching, here is day 4 of the previous 2 years of Valentine Card Series. You can click on either one to check them out. Thank you guys so much again for watching. I hope you have an absolutely amazing day. Bye-bye.